Like Jeffrey said, my name is Ethan Coon. I'm at Oak Ridge National Lab. I'm going to talk a little bit today about sort of mathematical and computational and computer science methodologies that have been leveraging that we've been leveraging to sort of advance models in compound flooding and hydrology in general. Um, this work is joint with a bunch of different people through a couple different projects, but primarily supported by a Department of Energy project called the Southeast Texas Urban Integrated Field Laboratory. This was a project joint across UT Austin, Lamar University in Texas, Texas A&M, Prairie View A&M, and Oak Ridge and Los Alamos National Labs. But sort of contributions across a variety of people, some postdocs, some grad students, some more senior people. So it's been a great group to work with. So just to sort of get a sense of what I mean here and the sense of compound flooding, kind of to motivate a lot of this work. In Southeast Texas, compound flooding is the norm. And it's really stressing communities and infrastructure, right? And so what I really mean by compound flooding here is mechanism of floodwater generation. So on the U.S. Gulf Coast, there's this broad range of mechanism ranging from coastal storm surge, driven by hurricanes, including fluvial, so rainfall falling on a watershed that's accumulating in rivers and flowing downstream, and then pluvial, right? So it's sort of intense cloud bursts falling on pavement or other impervious surfaces that are then building up through flooding. And in these big hurricane events, all three of these mechanisms are happening together. They're making management more difficult. Individual events might sort of have more of one or less of one, but jointly they often show up together. So this is sort of all images from the Beaumont and Port Arthur areas in Texas. It's about, if you're not familiar with the area, about a hour and a half, 2 hour drive from Houston towards along the coast. But these are real images from the Beaumont area. You can see sort of from Harvey, which was largely for this area was largely a fluvial flooding event, where literally water is up over the elevated highway. Hurricane Imelda, yes, literally those people are sitting on traffic lights in the second image here. And then, just sort of nuisance flooding as well, that is quite common. So this isn't a named event. It was just a typical storm, but had some pretty intense cloud bursts. And these kinds of events, really affect people's ability to go to work, to go to school, to go, to sort of exist in their daily lives, right? And so these events have a big effect on how, how we interact with water in the Gulf Coast region. So how do we think about compounding events? Well, a lot of this is limited. Our abilities to think about compounding events are really limited by the types of models that we're using. And there's a wide range of models that are used in hydrology. I mean, the classic joke in hydrology is there are more hydrologic models than there are hydrologists in the world. That may be true. There's this range, and they've sort of come out of different communities, right? The sort of more longer time scale hydrologic models looking at how rainfall interacts with the land surface and the subsurface, thinking about mass conservation and flow laws as sort of ways of expressing flow. Then we get into the sort of more, often hydrodynamic and models, which are capturing now momentum conservation, so solving a shallow water equation of some form. And really focused on how water moves once it's generated. So moving across the surface, whether that's in a river, on a floodplain, in an urban area, but capturing things not only just sort of where the water is, but also at what velocity and the implications of the velocity field. Then we get into more managed systems. Obviously, flooding is not as important away from where humans are, the primary impact being humans. And so we think about sort of urban drainage models and models where water is being managed through engineered systems. So tracking flow through pipes, basins, pumps, drains. And a lot of this brings in sort of now pipe flow. And so these types of models are often explicitly resolving every pipe in a system, every culvert, every drainage canal or ditch, in an effort to really accurately track and use as a planning tool, as a infrastructure management tool, for how we're dealing with water. And then, then the last of these classes of types that we'll be thinking about here are flood inundation mapping. And these are really sort of much faster solvers, either fast marching methods that are using geospatial techniques, or shallow water equation solvers, which are really looking at very high resolution, maybe 1 meter resolution, but across very large range areas, right? So these can be full river basin solvers, and they're really just sort of moving water around to fit the terrain, but can also be a powerful technique. Um, so there's a lot of things that each of these have advantages, right? So hydrologic models really are good for fluvial flooding, and particularly when you downscale them to higher resolution to capture sort of exact inundation patterns. These can be a really powerful tool. They sort of include subsurface conditions, and so they include antecedent effects, right? Initial conditions that are setting the soil moisture, and therefore tell you how much is available to infiltrate before things start actually flooding. Whereas the rest of these tools don't capture that type of thing. Um, Looking at the hydrologic, or the hydraulic and the hydrodynamic models, right? These are sort of capturing the shock behaviors in systems, right? Sort of more engineered systems. Typically, they're used at sort of more neighborhood scales, right? So smaller extent, but higher resolution as a result of that. And so they're good for pluvial flooding in saturated conditions. They're surface only, right? As we get into the more managed systems, right, being able to represent the actual or synthetic pipe networks is a critical component. And so these are also good for pluvial, and particularly in urban cases. Um, and then lastly, flood inundation mapping is great as a downscaling tool, right? So often these can take input from another model, and then capture, the effects of any mechanism at the sort of higher resolution that is needed for decision making around management. So, but at the same time, I talked about each of these types of tools. There is, no real ability in any of these to really capture compound flooding. And one of the challenges in that, I would argue, is that, compound flooding is fundamentally a scale problem, right? That there's a scale challenge in modeling engineered flows to understand how compound flooding is happening. The engineered systems are often very small scale. You might think of a meter or 2 meters across a drainage ditch, or a storm drain, right? That's on the corner of a road, right? That's quite small, but how it really have outsized impacts on hydrology, right? Integrated over the entire basin, these features, these really small scale features, are changing the sort of processes. And so how do we resolve this scale challenge, or how do we even think about this scale challenge? Um, so on the right here, you see this figure from a Salvador et al. Paper that sort of is looking at this sort of range of scales, right, in both space and in time, of the various components of sort of full river basin managed systems. And this is quite a challenge. So I'm going to next sort of skip to a series of vignettes that are effectively driving, different strategies we've used in developing models to sort of capture these types of effects. So the first is a set of tools, and this is from a computers and geosciences paper, and a couple other efforts, but really looking at how do we represent these sort of long linear features of canals, of ditches, of drainage features, in our models. And so we've been calling this as stream aligned meshing. And so stream aligned meshes are really enabling high aspect ratio elements to capture the river corridor, or the drainage canal corridor. So just to sort of show a picture of what this looks like, the types of meshes that we're using in ATS, and for these types of sort of full river basin models, we're able to sort of built in through, sort of advanced mesh generation techniques, build in these long quadrilateral elements, right, which have higher aspect ratios, but track the underlying, river underneath the hood. So this is sort of the mesh superimposed with a ponded depth field of sort of water inundation, then superimposed on top of a Google map, right? Just to sort of see what's going on underneath in the real world. And you can see, sort of the main channel, the main stem of the river network, and these long, very straight irrigation and drainage ditches coming out of agricultural systems. So The smallest of these drainage ditches are on the order of 1 to 3 meters across. The sort of the river network is more on the order of 10 to 20 to 30 meters across. And sort of we're triangulating as we go away from that to build out this feature. And the software to do this, right, it can be quite a complicated process, and is usually a case of just finding good quality data, which is generically available at this point. I would say one of the biggest capabilities enabling this type of work has been the huge influx of standardized data tools and techniques for presenting nationwide data around hydrology. But it is effectively this, right? So the first step is simply resampling the raw data to a characteristic length scale, right? What's the discretization times space scale that we're trying to resolve? Then there's always sort of this cleanup pass. And there's been, this will be the only time I say the word artificial intelligence, but there's been a lot of work in sort of using AI and machine learning tools to kind of clean up some of this data in automated passes where we have heuristics of what we want it to do, but don't necessarily have a clear, algorithm throughout. But cleaning up the geometry to sort of remove acute angles or tangled elements that would get formed by very high resolution data that isn't well represented by the resampled data. Um, Define finite width elements based on stream network properties, triangulate away from the network, and then last bring in the elevation to bring in the elevation map, and sort of burn in these river elements based on a bankful width, or a bankful depth that is sort of formed by a bankful cross-sectional area divided by the width of that element in order to sort of keep the cross-sectional area constant as we move downstream along that element. So just to show the sort of impacts of doing things this way, it seems fairly self-evident that sort of more targeted, element structure and unstructured meshing is more computationally efficient here. But just to show the numbers, comparing this sort of stream-aligned meshing, SAMP streamlined meshing on the left, and then a sequence of refinements of triangulation. Ranging from coarse to what we're calling superfine. And I apologize for these qualitative terms, but there's not a great way of characterizing this when you're sort of refining the triangles increasingly near the stream just to make the superfine problem computationally even tractable. And if we look sort of jumping down here to the CPU hour times, right? There's a impressive speed up by using the streamlined meshing relative to any of these sort of coarse, intermediate, fine, and superfine variants of the just purely triangulated tin mesh. Um, so then showing that, okay, that's great. But what do we actually get from doing this sort of from a results perspective? The biggest difference, right, is just the sort of pattern of if we map the inundated area onto the mesh, right? So looking at again the coarsest mesh, you can see the individual triangles appearing, right, to the intermediate, to the fine and the superfine, where now at this point the stream-aligned meshing picture starts to look a lot more like the superfine picture. And so if we look at the exceedance probability as of the inundation fraction here, you can see that the tin meshes are in fact converging to effectively the stream-aligned portion. This is kind of cheating, right? But this is the obvious result, right? When we build in the river network into the mesh, even though the river network arises naturally as a course of the physics, as a course of the equations being solved, we are able to sort of do a better job of capturing that pattern. But also when we move to other metrics, so looking at stream flow, looking at subsurface water content, at surface water content, and at surface evaporation, you can see that keeping the water in the right places is a important thing for getting the global mass balance right as well. So with stream flow, you don't see huge differences as water moves down the stream, but you can see that the sort of the course has a decent amount of error. And actually, as we refine, we're again converging toward the stream-aligned mesh result. Subsurface water has a bigger implication here, right? And surface water obviously related to the same inundation pictures that I showed before, has a big difference. But maybe even things that are less, self-evident, right? So if you look at, for instance, evaporation, that increased inundation area in the triangulated meshes are resulting in increased evaporation, which is affecting the global mass balance. So getting this sort of pattern right has a lot of implications for the physics, and in fact is working quite well. So then, looking at these kinds of unstructured meshes brings its own complexity, right? And so just sort of, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but appreciating the fact that this is an applied math community, I get to talk a little bit about this in a way that maybe I don't talk about this in my hydrology talks. But effectively, in order to solve things on these, we need to think about advanced discretizations. We can't simply use standard, maybe finite volume or two-point flux approximations because they simply won't work well in these types of meshes. And so we use discretizations from a set of mimetic finite difference family of methods. This is work led by Konstantin Lipnikov at LANL, but building then out a sort of a pretty standard PDE-based solver stack of linear solvers. Obviously these unstructured meshes result in very strange sparsity patterns in our matrices. And so we tend to lean on sort of very generic solvers that can handle that, strange sparsity structure. Looking at nonlinear solvers that are beyond sort of standard Newton methods, but things like Krylov accelerated methods and things like nonlinear Krylov accelerated methods, which require a significant investment in globalization. So these are sort of line search, but physics-based methods that are looking to globalize the problem and make it converge faster. It also relies on a pretty complex mesh infrastructure tool that's been developed over the years at Los Alamos to sort of be able to represent these really arbitrary polyhedral meshes, right? They end up with, if you look at the top down, you end up with anything from triangles up to pentagons. As you're bringing in junctions across the river network, you end up with even more faces in a given cell, and then all of those are extruded in the vertical to capture the 3D component of that. So these they're just sort of looking quickly at these second order mimetic methods, right? They're sort of built on this staggered or hybrid type of element where you're capturing each of a flux across each face, a pressure on each face, or a primary variable on each face that's being diffused and on the cell as well. Then typically we sort of eliminate one of the unknowns and we're able to build out a system that is just the faces, a single unknown on each face that's equivalent to a Lagrange multiplier and a single unknown on the cell. So these sort of these mimetic difference methods mimic the continuous properties of operators discretely. They're discretely conservative. And second order on star convex distorted polyhedra. So they're quite general, right? This is a really general class of methods, which makes it very powerful for these very strange meshes, right? And it's sort of one of a sequence of options that have been built in to the code base. This also raises challenges of efficient preconditioning. So there was a paper that Constantine led at AWR looking at this, but effectively the standard pathway for thinking about these is you take your nonlinear PDE, you discretize, and then you linearize, and then you sort of develop a nonlinear solver around that. And he was able to show that there are advantages to instead first linearizing your continuous PDE, then discretizing the linearized version, and then using your solver there. And so there's an interesting paper now, almost a decade old, right? That was done in this to enable this work to solve efficiently and accurately. So now looking at some of taking this into the real world, how do we apply this? This is a Village Creek domain that we were looking at. Again, you can see Houston on the lower left and Beaumont, Port Arthur, where our study area was. This is a largely underdeveloped, sort of not, let's say suburban to rural basin, not too managed. And this was sort of the first step of testing these sort of streamlined meshes that we were working with. And so bringing in all this data, right? So everything from infrastructure and land cover, impervious surfaces, a DEM, bringing in NRCS soils. So this is now porosity, permeability, right? The sort of subsurface fields that are needed. Um, and sort of running now, driven this with daily and hourly data. So precipitation at both daily and hourly timescales, but sort of other things like temperature and incoming radiation and terms like that allow us to capture the mass water balance. And so evaluating the code when we use these meshes, you can see stream flow on the top at the outlet of these domain, and just comparing to both the national water model, which is sort of the standard strawman target for any hydrologic code at this point, and the USGS gauge actually observing stream flow. And if we look at sort of both in a linear and a log scale, you can see that ATS is doing a pretty good job of representing the higher flows, a reasonable job at representing the low flow periods. And then if we sort of zoom in, you can start to see some of the peaks and so on. It's also doing a good job of capturing evapotranspiration and sort of the other fluxes based off of the best available data for measuring this. Um, and a lot of the things that I think is worth noting that these streamlined meshes really allow us to capture peak flows better than they were, right? So if we compare, for instance, the look on the right for a sequence of three events, or sorry, of four events. The black line here again being the observed quantity, the gold and the purple being daily and hourly driven ATS simulations, and the green being sort of the national standard of the national water model. You can see we're capturing the timing and magnitudes of these peak flows. The magnitude maybe not as well, but the timing quite well. Really, I would argue due to this streamlined meshing work. So that's one step. The next step that's critical for looking at these kinds of compound systems is being able to represent infrastructure throughout them. And I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly, but I just wanted to sort of present, from a computational math perspective, how writing good software really allows us to be extremely flexible in our model design. This is a case where, in the case of infrastructure in particular, there's a lot of uncertainty as to, first of all, infrastructure is extremely localized. So how do we think of it in the sort of broader context of a full river basin? And how do we represent that in models? And what I would argue actually is that in a lot of cases, we don't necessarily know a priori when we go into doing our modeling effort, when we go to talk to a community or a water agency, we don't necessarily know right away what the right way of representing their infrastructure is. We have some of the building blocks, and those are well established, right? Everybody sort of has a sense of, from the engineering literature, what a culvert does or so on. But particularly when you get into things like, let's say floodplain buyback programs and things like that, there's a lot of uncertainty into the exact implications of, changing something from a parking lot to a park. What's that going to mean for sort of localized flooding? And that process uncertainty is a key part of the modeling strategy. And so what we want to do is really build out software that allows us to quickly prototype and leverage, still in high performance computing environments, leverage sort of quick prototyped development of infrastructure. And so just looking at a couple of these components, I'm going to skip through some of this fairly quickly, but these are big water areas, right? These are areas on the Gulf Coast that get a ton of water, and they do these sort of big infrastructure projects to do this. And things like huge detention pond basins where they have this large canal that's sort of draining a good portion of the area, and then there's this much bigger area behind it here that's this sort of detention basin. And when the floodwaters in the canal get too high, they open these giant gates, and the water just sort of goes flowing out in this and really fills this whole back area. And so being able to represent that, and the implications of that on both discharge downstream, but also sort of stage in the canal. So maybe looking at this bottom plot, you can see the blue, the canal stage and the green of the detention basin stage. There is still water appearing in the detention basin in this dotted line here, right? Just due to subsurface flow, right? There's nothing, these aren't lined. There's nothing keeping the water from naturally, flowing into them from the subsurface. But when we open the gate, you can see obviously we get much higher water stage in the detention basin and reduced stage in the canal. Um, Looking at things like pump systems, right? So much of Port Arthur is a coastal city here is actually below sea level. And so it's protected by a levee, but you have to pump water out of this area and up into the neighboring canal to actually get it out of your city. And so representing sort of these large pump stations, which may have 12, 15 different pumps, some electric, some diesel, a variety of capacities and so on, but being able to sort of group and aggregate these pumps into a reasonable way of representing them in a model. So again, looking at sort of different pump efficiency curves at how well the pumps are able to move water out. That's actually a question that's not just of the engineering component of the pump, but also of the state of the system at the time. So the pump is at a fixed level, it's bringing in water from a fixed head, but the downstream head might be higher or lower. So for instance, in a case where there's storm surge coming in, raising the water level in the downstream portion of the canal from storm surge, that can make quite a difference in how much the pump system is able to remove water from the city area. So being able to capture those sort of dynamic couplings is really important. Um, Looking at things like infrastructure, looking at things like impervious surfaces. There's this sort of sense of there are two types of impervious surfaces. One is a non-connected impervious area. So this might be like the roof of your house or your driveway, right? Where water lands on it, it doesn't infiltrate, it instead flows off onto your lawn nearby or some other pervious surface. And so you're reducing the effective infiltration ability of the soil, but you're not taking the water out of that region. It's still a local effect. And so we call those non-connected impervious areas. And they're implemented simply as a reduction of the relative permeability or the effective diffusion coefficient into the subsurface. Um, and that's different than from directly connected impervious areas, which are sort of more, larger scale, more commercial or urban systems, where now the rainfall that lands on these impervious areas are immediately shunted into a storm drain, which may or may not be clean and may or may not be clogged by that maintenance or lack thereof, but then run off into the nearby stream network. And so from the perspective of these 15-minute to hourly systems, more or less trying to instantly remove this water, but limited by sort of the maximum capacity of the storm drain system. And so we're able to represent both of these types in these models. And so the workflow for doing this looks a little bit like this. This is just a toy problem. But effectively, we've sort of identified here in the upper left a parking lot in red. We've sort of said, okay, well, in that parking lot is connected to a drainage network. And so you can see where each of there might be storm drains that are, running from each of these colored areas to the corresponding reaches that are again mapped in with these stream-aligned meshes. And then everywhere else that there's impervious surfaces, we're saying, okay, well, these are non-connected impervious surfaces, and therefore might be just reducing the infiltration capacity. And so we've looking at these sort of toy problems, made sure we're understanding things like the differences between if all of this is disconnected versus if all of this is connected, or sorry, all of this is not non-connected versus all of this is directly connected. You can see the sort of in a directly connected case, it's able to quickly move the water. And again, looking this now is discharge as a function of time in this downstream river outlet of the entire basin. But the directly connected impervious surface is able to quickly move the water into the stream. And so you see, before things are saturated, As the storm first starts to happen, the directly connected does increases discharge and makes it flashier. But both have pretty similar effects in the sort of longer term once things are saturated, and most of the movement of water is happening on the surface. Again, making the system flashier, higher peak flows, shorter recessional curves. And so I just want to comment quickly because this is SIAM, a little bit on the software and the mathematics that allows this, and allows us to implement these sort of on the fly, specific to a given region, and as we move to a given site. And a lot of this is really built out of graph theory and sort of mapping mathematics into graph theory. So Arcos is a multi-physics tool that underlies Amanzi ATS and is really how we sort of think about implementing mathematical PDEs into code. And it really comes from this concept that any given sort of multi-component, multi-phase, PDE, multi-conservation system can be expressed as a set of PDEs and a set of constitutive relationships. And so, for instance, in this case, I'm looking at just a subsurface flow coupled to a subsurface energy equation, kind of a standard Richards equation for flow and an advection diffusion equation for energy. And we split these, if we write out the full PDEs, right, we can think of it as really under this graph of PDEs. So we've got our flow equation, we've got our energy equation, and we've got our coupler. And the coupler is sort of managing things like the off diagonal terms of a Jacobian and things like that, right? So the coupling terms, right? But underneath the hood of all of these equations are a ton of constitutive relationships. And so this is sort of how we think of building out these equations. And from this set of PDEs, right, we want to build this into the building blocks, right? The building blocks that allow us to develop the tool. And so, for instance, just taking a very simple example of this is now water content in the subsurface. Maybe you're writing your water content to be porosity times a density, which might be a function of temperature and pressure, times the saturation of the soil, which is a function of pressure. And we turn this into a graph, right? And so in this graph, we really think of there being primary variables, right? So the variables that we're solving for. There are independent variables. Those might be data. So in this case, I'm saying temperature is prescribed, porosity is a soil property and is prescribed. And then there are secondary variables, which are, sort of functions of those primary and independent variables. And this is actually sort of this really simple concept is actually an extremely flexible concept when you get into the software. So for instance, if we want to now add freeze thaw processes, so adding ice, maybe not so important for Southeast Texas, but important in other areas, right? We would change our water content sense, and now it includes a saturation of liquid and a saturation of ice. And at the end of the day, the graph here changes, right? We sort of have different representations and different components. But the key thing is here to the flow PK, to the flow PDE, all it really needs to know is, do I have a water content? And can I differentiate that water content as a function of my primary variables in order to pass it off to a solver, right? So we can sort of build out these more complex systems of PDEs now by saying, okay, we have this concept of a water content, but also of energy, and this sort of builds a denser graph. And the key things to note are, right, these are directed and acyclic, and so all that simply tells us is that we can hand this off to a graph search algorithm that knows how to go to the bottom and start evaluating individual components. Think of each box as an individual constitutive equation in a PDE, and can start handing that off to a task-based scheduler to sort of solve this system. And so, a more complicated set of coupled PDEs then turns into obviously a more complicated graph, but building up from the primary variables, in this case, pressure for flow, temperature for energy, up through a set of residual equations that allow us to hand off to the solver. And the key thing here is that each of these boxes are now customization points. So if we want to add a new infrastructure component that adds a source term or a sink or a flux of water from here to there. It's actually quite straightforward to sort of say, okay, we're going to add another box to this graph. We're going to recompile the graph on, at runtime, regenerate the graph, and then hand that graph off to, a solver. It brings a lot of advantages in sort of testing and other aspects as well. But I just wanted to sort of to highlight what goes into these multi-physics tools. And so it allows us to think about interfaces, right? So each of these components are implementing interfaces. It allows us to automate a lot of things. Once you think about a PDE as sort of being, built of these component pieces, you can think about things like fully automated sequential coupling of strong implicit couplers that are formed through implementing off diagonal blocks and Jacobians as needed. Um, the sort of this dependency graph, right? This directed acyclic graph of the various constitutive equations really automates the evaluation process. So we can sort of never recompute things that were already computed if we know that they've been done by other components. It actually we do a lot of pre-checking. You form this graph in the code, and we can do a lot of checking of the code to make sure that the discretizations are consistent across the graph, and the sort of things that are needed on cells versus things that are needed on faces can be defined consistently across the graph. And it also then sort of makes it trivial for us to automate the chain rule and sort of assemble a Jacobian. You hand off, each box implements its partial derivatives. You hand that off to the software, and it's able to sort of do the full chain rule to assemble your Jacobian. Um, and this sort of concept from a user perspective has a lot of appeal, right? To users, this means there's sort of a runtime selection of models from the input file, and so the model structure isn't fixed when you come into ATS. It's quite trivial to add these sort of models through symbolic Python and code generation and things like that, and we can really control how those are implemented in the back end in terms of whether they're calling out to a coprocessor or something like that in an HPC resource. And this genericness, right, really allows better testing and better strategies for assembling these models. Our goal in these types of multi-physics codes is really to allow our hydrologist partners to really focus on writing physics and not writing software, not writing model control code. And just to sort of show these are real, right? This isn't sort of toy problems, right? These can get quite complex, right? These graphs they're formed from all of these components. So now let's just look a little bit at how we're sort of taking those first two aspects of the talk, the sort of building out infrastructure by leveraging multi-physics tools and the streamlined meshing work to really come back to this question of modeling compound flooding. So this now is Port Arthur as we go back to our Southeast Texas region, which is one of the sort of main urban areas in the region. This entire area is basically at or just above sea level. And so you can sort of see all the different types of pumps that are showing up in the system that are sort of pumping water from one canal up into another canal, or in the case of these ones down here, up over a levee to get back into the ship channel that's down next to it. And sort of impervious areas that are showing up around both the industrial facilities. There's a big petroleum refinery area, and the sort of more urban regions of the city. And so if we just look at the current day operations, you can see as we build out these models, see if I can there we go. Capturing sort of a typical event at the time scale of 50 hours in this case, right? You can sort of see that the gate is acting here. This specific gate is around this sort of large detention basin that I was showing the pictures of before. That's over here. This dark blue area. And you can sort of see as the gate opens and then it sort of fills up the detention pond, and the gate closes once it sort of fills up, and so then the canal stage sort of responds to that by leveling out, and then once the gate closes, continues to rise until the rain stopped and the floodwaters have sort of stopped in this area. Um, and we're able to sort of do, sort of no analog counterfactual scenarios around the infrastructure as a result of this. So things like with and without the detention basin and looking at the effects of that. Um, just sort of glancing quickly at the complexity of this, right? As you're bringing in all of these pumps, there's sort of a lot of different pump behaviors going on with pumps turning on and off, and a lot of these are actually controlled by automated stage systems that are sort of monitoring the stage in the canal, and then turning on various combinations of pumps as needed. And so this sort of modeling tool, helps them think about how these sort of pumps are working and when they're working. But it also allows us to go after things like infrastructure design and trade-offs of various types of infrastructure. So now this is a case where they're considering expanding the existing detention basin, which you can see in the picture here, to include a much larger area across on the other side of the canal. And we can kind of do these kind of counterfactual scenarios of what are the implications of that, both locally in the local region around the basin, but also across the entire city. Um, and so, look, just sort of plotting a couple of these impacts. Skip through this. Um, they're sort of, whoops, one too many. Looking at the impacts, you can see from the original detention basin or the solid lines to if, with an expanded detention basin and the dashed lines, the sort of the gates increase greatly. There's much more water stored in the detention basin or sorry, there's actually it takes a longer time to fill up the detention basin in the expanded case, and the sort of water levels in the neighboring canal drop as a result. But it's not just sort of the local detention basin that sees that impact. So this is looking now at three sensors that are across the region, and you can see that this sort of change in the detention basin has effects both upstream and downstream of the detention basin itself, um, and corresponding changes in flooding and patterns of inundation. Um, Looking at things like compounding effects, we were sort of expecting to see a little bit more of a signal here, but this is now a case where looking at increased storm surge, where we're now looking at raised water levels in the shipping channel, where these sort of pumps that are moving water across onto the levee are, and in the main canal draining a bigger area as effective storm surge. And you can see sort of the effects of storm surge having on these pumps and sort of the ability of these pumps to drain the neighborhoods around them. Um, and lastly, I think one of the biggest things that we've learned in this work is the importance of sort of keeping the storm drains clean. This is something that's sort of known by the managers, but they liked seeing the evidence in order to go after their city planners and their city operators to be able to say, hey, this is really important. Keep your drain waters, your storm drains clean, and our system will work better for you. So looking at sort of what happens when you have clogging and reduced maximum drainage of these storm systems, the pattern's actually quite complex, and it's kind of interesting. There are actually areas that see increased flooding when you have where the storm drains are, obviously in the sort of urban area, this stretch along the coastline. The peak depths increase when you have clogging because the system isn't able to drain. But in some of the downstream areas, so this is actually an industrial complex that is sort of more generally maintained, and some of the downstream detention basins that are getting the water out, flooding is actually reduced because they're getting less water. The water is coming to them more slowly. So maybe not a surprise, but I think it's sort of an interesting implication of the work. And lastly, I'll just sort of show this as a bit of an example now. One of the challenges of doing this is, Port Arthur is quite a small area, and we're really representing the entirety of the river basin. So this is now, the full river basin being modeled. And you can see that even at this scale, we're at about 100, 150 meter resolution with each of these triangles away from the river networks. It's still not quite high enough resolution to realistically be able to say, is this house being flooded? Is this power substation being flooded? And what are the implications for infrastructure and so on? And so we've been looking at sort of iterative downscaling approaches that sort of represent mechanism as they're being used to take these sort of triangulated, coarse gridded images of inundation and now bring them down to the sort of 1 to 5 meter resolution where you can actually do sort of planning around. And at the end of the day, that comes from the fact that we trust what the hydrologic model is doing in terms of putting water in the right area. And now this sort of downscaling strategy is just giving us a more detailed solution based off of the more detailed topography there. So with that, I'll conclude and note that sort of these results are highlighting the necessity of representing engineered water infrastructure and thinking in this sort of full river basin context, and that's sort of blurring the lines between what we traditionally think of a hydrologic model, which sort of captures movement of water, mass of water, with these sort of more hydraulic and urban planning models that are representing sort of more detailed engineering systems, traditionally at much smaller scales. I think we can kind of capture some of the best of both worlds as we start to blur these lines. Resolving narrow channel flow through these streamlined meshes captures inundation patterns with sort of much cheaper computational needs. The sort of pump station and gate structure representations are able to respond to dynamically to sort of fluvial floodway propagation and backwater coastal effects in canals, going after these sort of compounding flood mechanisms. Impervious area formulations capturing both pluvial and fluvial flooding are showing that sort of maintenance of your system is a key component to getting the most out of the investment in the infrastructure. And maybe the biggest conclusion that I would like to leave you with today is just this sense that simulations and compound flooding at scale, as we get into these really complex, large scale models, we can do a lot to sort of enable planning, to enable engineering, to enable the work that goes into these with our HPC, with our math. But we really need these sort of deep collaborations across sort of the engineering communities, the sort of scientific communities and hydrology and water resources, and the sort of software engineers and mathematicians that are sort of providing the chops to be able to make these kinds of models work. So with that, I'll leave you with one last movie, just because when you get into models at this scale, it's fun to look at the real world, and people get excited when they're able to sort of come in and see this is a Harvey scenario that we were looking at for the area, and just sort of being able to put these simulations on real maps and show them to people and really gets people engaged in the work, and that's been a rewarding part of this work, is sort of the collaborations across the community, being able to take modeling into communities who aren't used to looking at model results the way academics might be, and having conversations around what are the implications of some of the decisions being made around water management for their neighborhood, for their homes, their places, has been really fun. So with that, I'll stop here and take any questions.
All right, thank you, Ethan. If anyone has questions, they can just write those into the chat, and then I will manage that and ask Ethan. While we're waiting on that, Ethan, I have a question here about the streamlined meshes, and most everything you talked about today was in Eulerian formulations. Is there work being done or insights you can see being gained by also having like a Lagrangian point of view within the systems?
So in hydrology in particular, most of the time we think Lagrangian systems, we think, sort of particle tracking or reactive transport within those systems. From just a hydrologic perspective, I haven't seen much using Lagrangian systems.
Mhm.
There have been some interesting advances in shallow water equation solvers, though, that are looking at Lagrangian methods, and finding actually some significant computational speed up by taking that perspective. So it's not my area of research, and I don't
Mhm.
have a ton of knowledge, but I've seen a couple cool papers recently looking at that kind of thing.